Overwatch, the job of the tank is to make space. And to make space is a sacrifice. A sacrifice you make of your cooldowns, resources, HP, and potentially even your sanity. All for the sake of granting your team control over the angles that you will need to win the team fight and secure the point. But what happens when a tank just snaps? Maybe it's because they're having a bad game and not giving their best performance, but maybe it's because their team is genuinely being ungrateful and unhelpful. Maybe they're getting falsely blamed, or maybe they do just suck and have a bit of a temper issue. It doesn't really matter. Let's just say they're having a bad game, and the problem is they're stuck on their role. Whether they like it or not, their job is to make space no matter what character they pick. But they cannot bear any more suffering for the sake of trying in vain to make some space for this team that they've honestly just come to despise. They just want to survive the remaining few minutes and get out the other end of this godforsaken match without frying any more brain cells from a caustic mix of frustration, stress, and resentment. So, what do? Oh no. Let me start this off with a little bit of an anecdote. While I say that, this isn't one specific game, more just a collection of multiple experiences I've had. This has been something I've noticed ever since almost the beginning of Overwatch 2, but I've never really felt like I truly understood what was going on here until recently. I remember there's been many times before where I've been playing a game on something like Zarya or Winston or Ball, and I will be dominating, and it'll be a really fun game and I'm really enjoying it. And it might even be that the tank that the enemy is on is a tank that already kinda soft counters me, but I'm just dominating anyway and it feels really good. Halfway through the game, the enemy tank is clearly getting a little sick of my shit, and so they decide to swap. Well, there's nothing new there, counterpicking's been in the zeitgeist of Overwatch for a long time, but this is the part that always nagged me. So many times I would see people swap Orisa in situations where I swear Orisa's just garbage. Like, it's not even like you're counterpicking me, but it's a bad pick for your team. It's a bad pick for your team, and you're literally not even countering me. At first, I just couldn't help but find this funny, but I didn't think much of it. I thought, well, I guess Orisa's a bit of a newbie character, so maybe they're just falling back on a really easy character. And I think that's a small piece of the puzzle. But it nagged me as I kept seeing this happen over and over again, that I'd see people continue to swap to Orisa when they started losing, in games where Orisa's literally a worse pick than what they were already on, both in terms of playing the counterpicking game and in terms of just trying to work with your team, that it was starting to bother me. It couldn't just be that Orisa's an easy tank to play. There are other easy tanks to play you can get some free value off of. Why is Orisa the panic button for every single raging tank player that just seems to have given up, regardless of whether she actually makes any sense in the situation you're picking her? Is it just that most people hate Orisa and they just want you to suffer? They think, oh, you've ruined my day, time for me to ruin yours, I'm going Orisa. I don't know, maybe that's part of it, but even that still didn't really feel right. To tell you the truth though, before I even continue with this video, I have a confession to make. If you don't watch my previous Overwatch content, like many people, I dog on Orisa. A lot. But if I'm completely honest, I think I have to admit something. I don't actually hate Orisa that much. Like, I don't like her, but she probably wouldn't even be in my top 10 most hated characters in this game. Okay, sorry for the quick diversion, but I just had to know. And the answer is, depending on the quantum superposition Lifeweaver over here ends up occupying, I don't know. It's complicated. Orisa is either my 15th or 16th most disliked character in Overwatch, which, considering the game has 42 characters, is honestly not even that bad. To be completely honest, the main reason why roasting Orisa just seems to be a tradition on this channel isn't actually because I think Orisa's the worst character to ever be added in Overwatch. That's Kiriko, silly. It's more so that even the most garbage design characters have their defenders, and it seems like Orisa's like the one perfect example where no one likes Orisa. So sometimes I honestly feel a little bit bad dogging on Orisa, knowing I don't even think she's that bad, but it's just, when I want a quick example of a character everyone hates for the sake of a talking point, it's just so much easier to pick the one I know no one's going to disagree with, even if I don't even think it's the best example personally, than one that maybe people will have an argument in the comment section with me about. But if I don't hate her that much, I guess that brings up the question, why do you guys hate her? And why does she feel so simultaneously overpowered and yet also so fucking garbage? Let's get that out of the way before we even continue. Because I think what most people would say, if they hadn't had much time to think about it, is the reason they hate Orisa is because, say it with me now, she never fucking dies. I'd say repeating this talking point is beating a dead horse, but I mean, the horse never dies, so I guess it's shooting a dead horse when the worst thing you could possibly do is shoot the horse, stop shooting the horse, stop shooting the horse, stop shooting the horse. Oh, anyway. But I think there's a bit more to it than just, oh, Orisa doesn't die. In fact, in terms of pure health bar numbers, Orisa's actually pretty middling as a tank. There are other tanks with bigger health bars than Orisa. I'm not saying people are wrong to say Orisa never dies, but I'm just saying let's be honest here, Orisa's far from the only culprit. There are a lot of tanks that never die, quote unquote. But I think what's special about Orisa is the fact that she has so much damage mitigation.
Peter, the horse is here.
So when you combine that with healing, that's what makes her feel unkillable. And Orisa without healing falls over like a wet paper towel within a few seconds. But Orisa with healing just sustains infinitely and basically can withstand any amount of damage. And don't get me wrong, a toned down version of this is true for all tanks, but Orisa in particular, because so much of her kit is armor and damage mitigation, whenever she receives healing, she effectively receives twice as much health as any other tank. And I mean, if you take a second to actually read the healing numbers at the end of your quick play games and compare that to how big a health bar is, that might help give you an idea of just how much of the health you have to cut through in a team fight isn't even the original health bar, but is just healing from the supports. And that will help to explain a lot of why doubling the effectiveness of that healing with damage mitigation is what makes Orisa literally an unkillable goddess. That's the obvious one everyone says, but I honestly think if anything that might be the least important thing about Orisa that makes people hate her. Beyond that, there's some other low-hanging fruits, like the fact that she's very low skill expression as a tank and has a lot of guaranteed value. When it comes to things that take skill on Orisa, for the most part it is knowing when to press your buttons, a skill that applies to basically every character in the game and definitely every tank. Knowing how to position well, except that's even easier than usual on Orisa because you basically don't move, so you don't even have to keep reconsidering where your new position should be, you just pick a spot and you defend it. Shooting things, in fairness, is a skill that most tanks don't have to worry too much about, but Orisa does, except for the fact that she has some of the biggest shot hitboxes in the entire game and usually fights pretty up close, which means that it's really, really easy to land those shots. Not to mention the same kind of goes for Javelin, where it's a bit of a skill, but like, let's not pretend landing Javelins is insanely difficult. When it comes to anything beyond the bare basics that basically every character in the game has to learn to be played competently, Orisa really doesn't have much in the way of specialized skills. In fact, this might be an area in which I actually defend Orisa a little bit here. I think it's a tragedy that whenever Orisa gets nerfed, it seems that we always like to nerf things that make her take even less skill, rather than finding ways to nerf her free value. Like making it so she moves even slower in Fortify. I know that was a mechanic in the past, but we got rid of it and then we brought it back. Or removing the mechanic where Fortify used to make it so that you generated less heat when firing while using Fortify. That added a little bit of an extra layer of resource management skill to Orisa, and I thought that was quite a cool and unique mechanic. But then one day they just decided to completely remove it. And again, I know it's because they were nerfing Orisa, and nerfing Orisa in a bubble, in a vacuum is fine, but nerfing Orisa in a way that takes an already very low skill character and takes away one of the few unique mechanics that tested skill is kind of a bad thing in terms of just pure character design, ignoring balance. But there is just one change that was a buff to Orisa that most people think was absolutely terrible, but I'm not going to lie, I actually think it's the best change she ever got, at least talking design-wise. That being the complete removal of her damage fall-off in the mid-season patch of Season 8. Before that point, Orisa used to do significantly reduced damage beyond a short to medium distance. The reason why I think this is a good change is the one thing that's kind of unique to Orisa as a tank that most of the tanks don't have to worry about that takes skill on Orisa is landing long shots. Because of the fact that your bullets shrink the further they travel, the shots get harder the further away characters are, not to mention the usual travel time also have to factor in, and the fact that javelins also can work from a distance, but then you have to take into account the slight arc and the travel time and the blah blah blah. One of the few times I die to an Orisa and I actually go, you know what? Good on you. Honestly, I can't even be mad that I actually just got outplayed. Is when they absolutely yeet a javelin from a mile away and actually catch me with it, because they just hard read my movements like a book. That is like the one time Orisa can make a play, and it's like, wow, that took some skill. I appreciate that. So as much as I realize most people despise the fact that Orisa doesn't have damage fall off anymore, I ask you, if you reverted that back to how it was before, what the hell would Orisa even have anymore that would even take a single brain cell? At that point, just delete the entire character, which, in fairness, that might be nice if it was on the table, but we know that's not on the table. The fact that Orisa is such a low-skill character, and so she can't be pushed very much, means that the baseline amount of value she gives for just existing has to be higher than most other characters. And that's what's frustrating sometimes about losing to an Orisa, is either because you feel like you were counterpicked, so you didn't feel like you lost the fight because you did badly, you feel like it was because they swapped Orisa. But the other thing that can feel bad is knowing that you didn't die there because the Orisa's smarter than you died because the Orisa has bigger numbers than you. You know, that just never feels good. But that brings me on to my next point, the keepaway mechanics of Orisa. Orisa does seem to have a bit of a specialty in being a tank that just pushes people away. I mean, other tanks can do that, but most of the time only a small amount, whereas Orisa both has Javelin Throw and Javelin Spin on relatively short cooldowns. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I knew this was a part of Orisa's identity, but I used to think, nah, it can't be that annoys people, because it's really not that intrusive. But I slowly started to realize, I think this is actually a bigger part than people admit of why they hate Orisa, because of a pretty simple fact. Generally, the most beloved characters in this game are either dive characters or rush characters, both of which need to get close to their targets to deal decent damage. Orisa, at least in a 1v1 situation, basically makes just about any dive or rush character feel useless against them in a 1v1. Not only because of the fact she just has bigger numbers and she gets more stuff done for free, but also in the fact that for the dive or rush characters to actually deal decent damage, they'd have to be able to get in her face, but she can just spear them away and javelin spin them away, and they can't get in. Obviously, many tanks would also fall under this umbrella, but I'd say the most obvious one to point to as an example is this is why you hate playing Reinhardt into Orisa. I wouldn't even say that Orisa hard counters Reinhardt. It's definitely not an easy matchup, but in my experience, it's not really one-sided. I'd say it's like a 60-40 maybe. But I feel like people probably know that deep down, and it's less a thing of they genuinely think it's unwinnable to beat an Orisa as Reinhardt, and more a thing of whether they can win or not, it feels like garbage, constantly trying to make plays and constantly getting knocked back into a wall every time you walk forward. But this brings me to the final reason why I think most people actually do hate Orisa. And so far, all these points have been varying levels of, like, you know, recognized. I've seen people talk about it. This point, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's thought this, but I've never heard anyone else say this. I'm going to argue that Orisa is the only tank in Overwatch 2 right now that doesn't really take fights to take angles. She just keeps them. Now, I will admit, this is a bit of a blurry line, and some people's ears might perk up if you're a bit of a longer time player at the mention of this, and realize that what I'm describing is really kind of an off-tank, not a main tank. For those of you who are out of the loop, back in Overwatch 1, when it was 6v6, 2 tanks on each team, we used to have designated, at least community-recognized, main tank and off-tanks. And I'm very glad that a while ago I decided to look up the actual definition of what these things mean, because people vibe it out mostly, it seems. And honestly, I feel like it's so much more informative when you actually know what it means instead of trying to vibe it out. Even if when people vibe it out, they tend to sort of be in the right area. Long story short, main tanks make space, off tanks enforce space. The main tanks actually take fights to take angles, they actually push up, take areas of the map and make it so that's their team's area of the map now. And off tanks don't really do that so much. They might have a slight ability to push forward, but for the most part, they just kind of sit in the space the main tank makes for them, and makes it really, really difficult for the enemies to take it back. Now, of course, it can get a bit messy with some tanks where it becomes kind of ambiguous whether they are an off tank or a main tank, or whether they are an off tank or main tank can change depending on the team comp they're in. So let's just stick to some really obvious examples. While there are characters like Ball and Sigma where the lines get a bit blurry, there are 3 off-tanks that basically everyone agrees are off-tanks: Zarya, Roadhog, and D.Va. Now those characters still exist in Overwatch 2, and if they are off-tanks, that means they should enforce space and not make space. But that's the thing. Your character kinda doesn't function in a single tank format if your tank isn't capable of making space. So although they were originally designed to not be able to make space, but instead just enforce it, they have received tweaks going into Overwatch 2 that have made them a bit more able to make space. Don't get me wrong, they're not as good as the main tanks at making space, but you can tell they've slightly main tankified these tanks. Not to mention, even when they are a little impaired in making space, they still make space. They have to, because of the fact that just about every other off-tank in the game loses any long-range duel. They have to get up close to get their kills, but because they have to get up close, that means they have to take space. Because if they don't, they'll just get cornered and surrounded on all sides, being shot by people who are too far away for them to take the fights. They have to make a play at some point, because otherwise they will just get surrounded on all sides and shot by people they can't shoot back at. But that's the thing. For as much as I do like the change where Orisa lost her damage fall off, that also means that Orisa is the only tank in the game that doesn't have to worry about getting in someone's face to kill them. So she kind of never actually has to make a play. Even if she just lets the enemy set up on high ground, don't get me wrong, that isn't good for you, but you can still duel them. Whereas if you were a Roadhog or a Zarya or a D.Va, you would be screwed. So that's going to be the main focus of this video. What it means that Orisa is the only tank that fights to keep angles rather than take them left in Overwatch 2, and why I think that's a bad thing. But first, if you'll allow me, I'd like to take a little detour to really explain the importance of something I've been talking about so far. I feel like there's a word that's been thrown around a lot when people talk about how to play Overwatch, but people really seem to underestimate how important it is. That being taking angles. And I mean, I didn't explain it at first because, I mean, you know what it means. It's like, okay, there's an area of the map where you'll have a new angle to shoot the enemies from, where maybe before you couldn't see them because there's a wall, but from this angle you can see them. So now you can shoot them. Great, cool. Now I am just reading vibes here, but I do get the vibe that a lot of people will say they understand the importance of angles, but when it comes to their actual games, they won't actually invest a lot of resources in taking angles. This might seem like a bit of a strange detour, but I just think this is the best way to explain what I mean. Have you ever been in a situation where you've got like low elo and low to mid elo players trying to tell you how to play the game, and they're giving you this like obvious advice you already know, but it's not even like the advice is wrong, but if you try and apply it in the situation, you know it won't work. Like, here's a great example. Stop shooting the tank, shoot the squishies. Shoot the supports, even better. That isn't bad advice, quote unquote. It is true that you are way more likely to win an entire team fight off of one kill if that one kill is on a support rather than on a DPS or a tank. Not to mention, it is so much less work picking one support and then mowing the tank over rather than trying to mow over a double-pocketed tank. It's not necessarily like this advice is outright wrong, but I'm sure you've had the experience before that maybe you're playing tank and your teammates start complaining you're being too aggressive, you're not getting anything done, you keep feeding, blah, 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 blah. And so you decide to tone it down a bit, play a bit slow. And because you're playing it slow, you're not extending really far into the enemy backline, so the only viable target for you to shoot is the enemy tank, over and over and over, and then they start shouting at you, stop shooting the tank, and it kind of feels like, well, what the fuck? When I go for the supports, you all complain I'm feeding, but when I go for the tank, you complain I'm shooting the tank. The reason why this advice is technically right but doesn't work a lot of the times when people give it in these situations without considering the context is because I feel like a lot of players kind of treat it like in Overwatch, when you make a play, it'll work because you're built different, and it'll fail because you're just bad. And don't get me wrong, obviously skill has an effect, but if we're talking like mechanical in-the-moment execution skill, I really don't think that's the majority of what wins fights in Overwatch. You have to set up and earn your victories. You don't just take a duel in the enemy backline and win. Well, sometimes you do, but not usually. Usually, you sort of go for a soft engage on that target, you force out their cooldowns, you get out for a sec, and then before their cooldowns can come back up, you go back in again, and you find them in a position where maybe they get booped away from their team, so they get isolated as you dive on them, and then because you boot them into an isolated spot and they have no cooldowns, now you can win the duel. But you can't cheat the staging, as some people like to say. You can't just appear in the enemy backline and be like, hey, I'm going to 1v1 you support and I'm going to win. Explodes to 500 cooldowns that drop on top of your head. Wow, guess I'm just bad at the game. No, maybe you're really good at the game. Maybe you can't miss a shot, but it doesn't matter if you can't miss a shot if you just appear in the enemy backline with no setup. So yeah, when these people tell you to shoot supports, they're not wrong, but they're really forgetting the steps that you need to take to get there. That's the important thing. Everyone already knows don't shoot the tank. Everyone already knows shoot the supports. But at the end of the day, just telling your tank stop shooting the other tank isn't helpful if you can't provide them a solution. If you can't tell them, hey, go to this angle, because then I think you could be able to get this support. Long story short, when you have a problem in Overwatch, I feel like a lot of people say the solution is to just do the thing that kills the problem. And sure, that's technically the solution, but if you just run in there and try and do the thing, you're going to get blown up. The solution is much more, okay, what angle will best help us make that thing possible? This angle. Okay, is that a possible angle for me to fight for? Yes, okay, I'm going to take a fight to try and take this angle from the enemies. Okay, we succeeded. Now that we have this angle, now we can maybe do a bit of a pincer and get behind them while still pushing from the front, and then maybe their supports can be taken out. So hopefully you're seeing why this is so important. I would say the 3 things that win Overwatch teamfights: 1 is skill, yes, but I would say it's literally only a third of the picture. Another third is ult usage, which maybe a third is a bit much, but yeah, somewhere around a third of it is ult usage. But I would say the most significant piece of the pie is just over a third of it, I would say, is your setup. And your setup is dictated by what cooldowns, ultimates, and resources that you force out of the opponents before you even start the team fight proper, and the angles that you take to begin the team fight. Because taking angles and baiting out cooldowns are the main 2 things you can do to set up a winning team fight. That means they are really important. However, to do either of those things, you have to make plays. You can't just sit in the back, and it depends on the comp, but a lot of the times you can't even just sit with your team and constantly huddle up together. There might be moments where you have to push forward alone or with only 1 or 2 people with you, rather than the whole team. Unless you're playing like a death ball comp where it's just like a rushy, brawly, run it down mid, all 5 of us. So this is where we begin to relate this back to Orisa. You see, making plays to take angles isn't just the tank's job. I do want to quickly dispel that myth. It is everyone's job to take space. It varies between characters, so it's a bit hard to give you a hard rule, but DPS do a whole lot of space making themselves. Supports, not so much, it varies. Ana can make a lot of space with a big anti-nade, but other than that, usually they do a bit more enforcing space than making it. But ultimately, I just wanted a quick detour to make that clear. It is not just your tank's job to make space. But yes, it is primarily your tank's job, in most compositions at least. Now this can be fun, because it puts you in the driver's seat as the tank. As I said, because of the fact that the angles that you have and the cooldowns you force before a fight dictate heavily whether that team fight is winnable or not, and dictates the kind of things your teammates can do without expecting their head to get blown off. That does mean that you do have a large degree of control over orchestrating how teamfights will go. You essentially get to pick the options that your teammates have. When you have a game on tank where you have even just a couple cooperative teammates, I'm not even asking everyone, but just 1 or 2 people on the team are trying to help, they don't even have to be good, it's a real blast. For as much as I'll complain about the tank experience in this video, because, well, 1, I do think it's important to improving the game, and 2, because we're talking about Orisa in this video, of course I'm going to be complaining about the tank experience. But for as much as I will be doing that, I will still make it clear that when I have not even good, but just serviceable games on tank, I thoroughly enjoy the role, and it's probably now dethroned support as my favorite role. But like I've stated in the past, it's less so that every game is suffering on tank. Again, even the neutral games, let alone the good games, can be a blast. It's more so the fear of knowing every time you hit Q, there's like a 1 in 3 chance you're going to be brought into a game that is hell on earth. Because as nice as it is that you get to be the one that decides what angles you try and take and what plays the team is going to try and make, and therefore decides the options that every other DPS and support will pick from in each team fight, it can also be hell on earth because it also means you have to engage first, every fight, and take the beating for everyone else. Now that's fine if your team follows up, but if they don't, it can feel like you're repeatedly bashing your head into the wall, getting punished over and over and over for literally doing the right thing. And because everyone can see that on the scoreboard, oh no. Now you have people screaming at you for literally doing your job for their sake. You don't want to walk into the team that has Discord, Anti-Nade, Bastion, Symmetra, but if you don't walk in, your team has no space, and then they're going to lose. And yet somehow people have this delusional idea that you just keep walking in because you think you're better than everyone else, and that you'll just live it. No, you know you're fucked, but you also know if you don't walk in there, your team is screwed. It's a really frustrating experience, so it's no wonder that tank is typically seen as the most tilting role in the game. It's kind of sad to think that most games on tank, you could probably just hide around the corner, effectively contributing nothing on Orisa and have a much better KD, and even though you would literally be throwing those games and screwing over your team, you'd probably be a lot more likely to dodge getting flamed just because you have a good KD and you haven't been feeding, quote unquote. Even if you quite literally are deciding, yeah, I'm not going to give my team any space, I'm not going to help anyone, everything is someone else's problem. Not to mention, this is a bit more of an obscure one, but I just really want to throw this one in there because it's a frustration that I can have at times. What the correct angle even is to fight for and take kind of depends on what your teammates are playing and planning to do. And in a no-comms game with randoms, playing an incoherent team composition where you're doing the best to glue it together with whatever tank makes at least the closest to sense with whatever your team is running. Sometimes it just feels like a complete blind guessing game, trying to guess what the hell that your teammates actually won. Definitely, I've had games where I don't have bad teammates, but I know that we're going to lose because I just have no idea what they are doing. It's not even a, oh, they're so bad they don't know what's going on. I can tell when they're actually in duels, they're holding their own pretty well, but it just seems like everyone's got a completely different idea of how they want to play the game, and I'm not even trying to go off and do my own thing. I'm trying to work with what other people are doing, but everyone has a completely different idea of what we're doing, and no one can agree on what angles we're taking and where the hell we want to engage from. And I know that some of these games are being lost purely out of that confusion rather than us actually being bad at the game. But yeah, nothing feels worse than fighting tooth and nail for minutes on end to take a high ground that no one uses on your entire team for some reason, even though it's right there and it'd be so helpful. I'm going to be completely honest. Well, I had been meaning to make a video on Orisa specifically for a while because she gets brought up so often, and it's been such a long-lived talking point. It felt like an explaining video about her was more than overdue. I admit I have ulterior motives for making this video. The real message of this video I want to get out there is I want to break the delusion that being passive is being a team player in Overwatch. It's literally the opposite of the truth. And honestly, I'm disgusted that we teach new players this. Like, how do I put this? I'm not actually frustrated that most new players are obviously going to be scared, and they're obviously going to be quite passive as a result, and they're obviously going to do a lot of hiding. Obviously, I don't think that's good that they do it, but I understand it and I wouldn't flame them over it. I mean, I wouldn't flame a new player full stop. I've seen people talk to new players to Overwatch a few times and introduce them to the game, and usually it starts out quite sweet, but then when you start seeing them struggling in their first few games, this is naturally going to happen. Oftentimes, I see people try to do the right thing in that they try to, like, you know, make them not feel so bad about it and be like, oh, well, you know, at least you waited for your team to group back up. You know, a lot of people don't do that, even at higher ranks. And that I can understand because, yeah, you don't want to trickle in. You definitely don't want to get staggered. You want to go in as a team. So, yeah, waiting for your teammates to respawn, that's good. But the one that I can't get over is so many times I will see people watch gameplay of someone who's brand new, and understandably, they're not very good for that reason. And when they watch that gameplay, when they try and think of something to tell them to make them feel less bad, they're like, oh, but like, you're really good at not just running in there and dying immediately. That's what all my teammates do in ranked. They all just run in there and die, and they get way too ego, and they just run in there and die. I see this so much that, like, people applaud brand new players incessantly for doing nothing. And again, I'm completely fine with giving new players support, but I want to support them for the things they've done. I don't want to reward them for quite literally doing nothing. Because aren't you just teaching them not to help their team? Like, literally, you are teaching them, hey, you didn't engage in that fight and you let everyone die, but you didn't die. You're smart for that. And again, I know these new players aren't doing it on purpose. They're new players. I'm more bothered by the people who are teaching the new players to play this way. And I'm sorry, I couldn't help it. Obviously, if you didn't know, while some of my most played characters are Anna and Brig, some of my other most played characters are dive tanks, particularly Ball and Winston. So you should have known this was coming. I just have to get this off my chest. Nowhere is the delusion that being passive is being a team player more obvious than in the fact that the average player despises having dive tanks on their team and seems to think that they're extremely selfish picks. Dive tanks literally sacrifice more than any other archetype of character in the entire game for literally nothing more than the sake of making space for the rest of the team to make your job easier. The cope that comes out to hate on dive tanks is genuinely psychotic, and if you are one of them, I'm sorry, you are actually the worst kind of player. I would rather play with Malga one tricks than play with you. The amount of times I have gone something stupid like 37 on 2 on Ball, and then my negative KD, DPS, and support start crying that I'm not babysitting them as a shield tank, and then I look at them dying on repeat, and it's because they keep sitting on low ground, even though I've literally cleared every high ground on the map. They have all the space in the world, and I am literally 1v4ing or 1v5ing sometimes in the enemy backline, and yet they still find ways to say, nah, it's my fault, actually. Sometimes even when we win, they start saying, well, actually, that's just because we hard carried you, says the guy with a negative KD. Alright, okay, I'm not going to turn this video into my fucking Ball grievances because it's a lot more common on Ball. But it's just true, especially Ball and Doomfist are just two characters where you can literally hard carry your entire team, do everything right, help everyone, peel for everyone, make tons of space for them, have a perfect game, and then get flamed at the end anyway by your own teammates. Even if you goddamn win and the entire enemy team is complaining about how much you destroyed them. I wish I was joking, but I'm not. I think it's such a fucking injustice that divey, aggressive characters, not just dive tanks, although those are obviously my forte, but also characters like Genji or Tracer or Sombra are seen as these selfish, ego-driven players that don't care about the rest of the team, when they're the ones that have to take a fucking beating from all the sleep darts, all the anti-nades, all the Discord orbs, all the buttons that the enemy team has to say fuck you for trying to make a play. They're the ones that have to deal with that shit. And in case you guys don't play dive tanks and you don't understand, we don't like that. We're not jumping in because we think we're not gonna get sleep darted or antied or whatever. We jump in because we know we are gonna, but we know if we don't, we're throwing. Again, you have to force out cooldowns. So you jump in there knowing full well they're going to throw sleep darts, anti-nades, everything at you. And the best you can do is just pray you can dodge them. But when you're surrounded on all sides by enemies and they're all investing resources on trying to catch you, and you only have so many buttons to dodge with, there's a certain point where it just kind of becomes numerically impossible. Now, usually this isn't much of an issue because usually if the entire enemy team turns around and hits every single button they have to explode a dive tank in their backline and they have no buttons left, that would mean that they also turned away from the front line, so anyone who wasn't participating in that dive can just run over the enemy team while they're not looking and have no abilities because they're too busy trying to bully the Doom or the Wrecking Ball in their backline. Honestly, people are literally the opposite of correct here. Ironically, it's the most passive characters in the game that are the least team play focused. I mean, think about it. Snipers kind of have to be passive by default, and think about how little snipers help out the team. Usually, they just live in their own little planet, taking random duels. I mean, tell me you haven't experienced this at least like 5 or 10 times. Someone completely C9s the point because they're too busy having their epic Widow v Widow sniper duel, so even though they're right next to the point and everyone else is dead and they just need them to touch for 1 second and then we win, they're too absorbed in their epic sniper duel, and so they just completely forget that this is a team game and the point exists. Snipers are like the #1 kind of character that just lives in their own world and says fuck the rest of my team, but then still expects help from the rest of their team. And the frustrating thing is, you can't even blame them that much because that's literally how you play them. It's not even just like the average sniper player is like screwed in the head or whatever. It's literally just, no, that's actually just how you play snipers in Overwatch, is that you demand resources from your team, but you also just don't help them and go pick your own fights and your own duels. That is how you play sniper. It's just unfortunate that it is a burden on your team. And beyond just snipers, I'd even go as far as to say that anti-dive characters, for lack of a better word, like Cass and Torb, both characters that are kind of pokey, kind of rushy, but mostly just exist to counter dive, I would say they aren't team players. Like, they are in the sense that if your team is getting incessantly dove, picking them might be a good idea, but outside the hit the button that kills the dive character to kill the dive character and save your support, yeah, you're kind of playing another character that just sits back and watches everyone else play out the team fight while you just poke from a safe distance and walk away when the going gets tough. So here's where I go for a real reach. I think that Orisa is probably the only tank in the game that isn't a team player in a similar way to snipers or a Cass or a Torb aren't a team player. And I would actually go as far as to say that for that reason, Orisa is antithetical to the spirit of Overwatch. At least the version of Overwatch that everyone misses. I think this is what people really mean when they cope delusionally about the game being so much better in the past. Asterisk, we have no idea when the past was, and we keep changing our minds about when Overwatch was good and when it wasn't. And we also can't describe what was better about it, except maybe 6v6 question mark. I think 6v6 and peak classic Overwatch is just something people cling to explain this feeling they haven't been able to put into words. This feeling like in the past, if they went to make a play in Overwatch, they would have fun. Things would happen that would be cool or satisfying or rewarding. Or at the very least, if it went wrong, it would be funny. But as players got more competent and understood the game better and knew what to expect, it got harder and harder to surprise them. And when you can't surprise players as easily, that means wacky random flanks don't work as well. But the thing is, Overwatch now, and not even recently but for a while now, has rewarded responding to aggression with obvious and easy solutions that are about as difficult as a QuickTime event way more than pulling off much more difficult, creative and aggressive team play, which gets devastatingly punished with ease if not perfectly executed. And don't get me wrong, when you do make aggressive team play that works, the reward is basically infinite. You just stomp forever infinitely if it works. It's so feast or famine, man. If you just make one slip up that close to closing out the team fight, the entire team blows up and you lose. It doesn't matter if you tried to do a much more complicated, much more difficult game plan and did 99% of it correctly, one mistake and boom, it's over. Meanwhile, the enemy team that's playing more defensively just has to exist and press the button that shuts down the thing when it jumps in their face. Now, this has always been the case with Overwatch and always been its biggest problem, but it's kind of gotten worse over time, at least in a certain way. There's actually a pretty decent argument to say, if anything, the opposite is true in terms of gameplay, that it used to be worse in the past and now aggression is a bit more rewarded, like with how we've kind of moved away from focusing on builder characters, and how maps that used to be much more defender favored have been given more flank routes over time. What people really miss isn't Overwatch 1, isn't 6v6, isn't DPS Doom, isn't Rhine Pin not having cancel. What people really miss is that we now have a culture in this game where the default behavior is to keep your head down and make as few plays as possible. Because God forbid you try and do something crazy, people aren't going to think it's funny, people aren't going to think it's creative or cool, people are going to flame you. And so that's what people learn. Do your job as a cog in the machine of your team, but never go above and beyond. Never try and help beyond the bare minimum expectation of what your character should do. And of course, because you're jaded out of ever having fun in this game again, you've got to spread that misery to others. Smugly put everyone else down whenever they make a play that fails, even if the reason it failed is because you just watched the fight play out without helping. But hey, to help would have been going above and beyond. You just have to do the bare minimum so they can't cry at you. Now, maybe the better of these players will keep their mouths shut and stop short of berating their own teammates, but just because they're not flaming you, don't expect them to actually get involved in any team fights or join the VC to communicate. Don't get me wrong, unhelpful teammates have always been here, but at the very least in the past, the game had a much more active attitude that, like, sure, it was embarrassing or disappointing when a teammate wasn't very helpful, but I mean, there wasn't this culture of shaming them for even trying. Whereas now it seems the culture has shifted to do whatever you can to look competent, even if it means never actually helping and just being cosmetic. So long as it looks like you're being competent because you haven't died a whole lot, just ignore the fact you haven't contributed anything all game. I really do think the way in which unhelpful teammates manifest is very different now. Again, before it was usually just people who had an ego a little bit bigger than what they were capable of. And don't get me wrong, can that be annoying? Yes, but ultimately, at least they're still trying to participate in the video game. And if they do succeed, they will help the team. It just might be that they're not that good. But honestly, I'm not usually in the business about complaining about people that aren't that good at the game. I'm in the business of complaining about people who are technically kind of good at the game, but they simply choose not to help. I think it's painful to think that a lot of these players aren't even bad players, but they have just been conditioned to sabotage their own teams with lone wolf behavior every single game they get in because it's the only way they can avoid being flamed. Even if the behavior they're engaging in to avoid being flamed, honestly, really makes them more flame-worthy than whatever they were doing before. You know, there's a sentiment that I see a whole lot whenever I play quick play. One that I'm sure you see a whole lot as well. Who cares, we lost, it's quick play. And how do I put this? I don't really think anyone who says this is being a bad person or whatever. I'm not about to make the argument that everyone needs to treat quick play like competitive, but I at least want to give a bit of perspective here. When I see this, not always, but 9% of the time, it's a DPS or a support player saying it. It's not usually a tank, and in fact, a lot of the times, they're saying it to a tank player. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes the tank player kind of deserves to hear it, but sometimes I can't help but feel a bit sorry for the tank player, because if you don't play a whole lot of tank, I need you to understand, when you have a team that's really unhelpful and you want them to get their shit together, it is frustrating for all roles, but at least a DPS can still take duels. So long as they manage to find isolated targets rather than trying to 1v5, DPS can still do things when their tank isn't very helpful. Now don't get me wrong, are they going to lose? More likely than not, yeah, if their tank is really bad. But at the very least, they can play the game. They can have some duels, they can try to have as much fun as they can in a losing game, and get out. If you're a support and you've got a really bad tank, maybe it's frustrating that you're going to lose because of the really bad tank and you feel like there's not a lot you can do, but at least you get to do a lot of healing, you get to have your hero moments where you make clutch plays that save people's lives at the last second and make up for the mistakes of your other teammates. Hell, funnily enough, even though I kind of dropped off of playing Lifeweaver once I realized they're not going to fix him ever, I still find that honestly, the most fun games I have on Lifeweaver are the ones where my team is just a fucking train wreck, because as much as that's not a good thing, at the very least I could have a blast just getting a life grip every 5 seconds from someone just feeding. And don't get me wrong, is that good in terms of winning? No. But is that good in terms of having fun? You know what? Screw it, I'm having a blast. We're gonna lose? That's fine. I'm having a blast while it's happening, and I get to save a whole bunch of lives. But then there's tank. Have you ever actually tried to have fun in a game on tank where you know your team is not going to help you and you know you're going to lose? It's not even a thing of being too competitive or anything. It's literally just any time that the team as a whole makes a bad decision, the consequences land on the tank. So you're suffering the consequences of the misplays of everyone else on your entire team. Again, to some degree, supports and DPS do as well, but they can at least still do their jobs, just to a lesser extent. Tanks can't even do their jobs without dying on repeat if they don't receive healing and they don't receive follow-up from their DPS when they engage on a target. They are fundamentally designed to need healing to sustain and hold areas, and they are fundamentally designed, with few exceptions like maybe Roadhog or Orisa, to be good at dealing AoE damage to multiple targets, but not so good at dealing burst damage to a single target to kill them before they get healed. In every single imaginable way, they set up the plays of the other two roles, but that means if the other two roles are just asleep at the wheel, they can't do anything. And that's a great source of frustration for the tank player that finally just snaps and picks Orisa. Because when they're just having an awful game, and them asking their teammates, please just stop trickling in one by one, please just pocket me when I try and hold this corner, and their teammates tell them, bro, shut the fuck up, it's quick play. God, wouldn't it just be tempting to just pick Orisa and go, fine then, I'll show you what it looks like when I don't care about what the team does, and I do just play my own game. This is why I just can't bring myself to truly hate the Orisa player. I have to pity them. Because when someone starts losing and swaps Orisa, more often than not, in my experience, it's not a counter pick. It is them throwing their arms up in absolute frustration with their team and saying, fine then, if I'm so bad at making space and taking angles, fighting a 1v5 on the front line every team fight while you all just watch from the distance, if this game is such a tank gap and you have no space, how about you try making some space? Go on, don't worry. I'll sit in the back and protect the supports, DPS, don't worry, you don't have to do that anymore. You can swap off Cass, you can swap off Torb. How about you try and take that angle alone? Good luck. Of course, as satisfying as it is to get your I told you so, in the vast majority of cases, this is doomed to fail. Usually, this will just lead to the entire team refusing to take any angles, all just sitting at a spot and refusing to budge from it, inevitably leading to them getting completely surrounded and melted, as the enemies take every single uncontested high ground surrounding them, and there is nowhere left for them to hide from the hail of bullets. Essentially, the stubbornness of the DPS and the Orisa to not participate in picking fights, all for fear of being picked on if it doesn't go their way, is what causes these teams to throw their games. But hey, at least the person who swapped Orisa gets to prove their point before the game gets thrown. The second they swap Orisa, suddenly the enemy has all the angles in the world, and suddenly it turns out taking space is actually pretty important, and the fights they were picking actually might have actually meant something. As much as this can be the tank's fault, I think it is fair to say that this stubbornness and refusal to participate in the fight is so much more present in most DPS or support players. Again, because while they will be hurt by poor teamwork, they can still do their jobs and enjoy the game even when they have poor teamwork. Tanks just can't. The most they can do is force out as many resources from the enemies as they can before they inevitably die on the front line. This is also part of why Orisa is so simultaneously broken and yet terrible. If you didn't know, although most of you probably do, Orisa's actually consistently had a very low win rate compared to most tanks despite all the fear-mongering around her. And in fairness, despite her low win rate, she's still a pretty semi-regular pick in high-level games in Overwatch Contender Series and such. Now in fairness, I do think part of the reason why Orisa's win rate is probably skewed is because of the fact that everyone swaps to Orisa when they're losing, which of course is going to drop her win rate. but I do actually believe that she probably isn't as effective as most of the tanks in the game in most scenarios. And again, it's because she doesn't take angles. The angles you take are the bedrock of the setup for the team fights you actually get to win. So the fact that you don't have the tools to take much in terms of angles, only the tools to use the angles you already have, means that when you pick Orisa, you're practically guaranteed to slowly lose ground every second of the game until it finally all collapses beneath you and it becomes impossible to survive anywhere. That is, unless you just have such big numbers that it doesn't matter and you manage to just kill every flanker that tries to take space from you, which sometimes works. But when it doesn't, oh god, Orisa is just a throw pick. But that is why, for all the reasons there are to hate the Orisa player, I honestly just can't bring myself to. Because Orisa isn't a counter pick. She's a cry for help.